Greetings, everyone. Welcome to our exclusive Global Leading Voices webinar campaign. We are delighted to have you join us here today. Please be informed that if you have any questions during the presentation, you may type them into the question box in your control panel. The presenter will answer your questions at the end of the presentation accordingly. Now, without further ado, we will turn the time over to our presenter, who will begin shortly.
Hi, everyone. I hope you're all doing well. My name is Jessica Mann, and I'm happy to be your presenter today. And our topic will be key steps to a successful ISO 14001 implementation. So here's the agenda for what we're going to cover today. We're going to start with what's new in ISO 14001 2015. And then we're going to do a little dive into sustainability and look at some of its key features and also some misconceptions about it and what is its relevance for environmental management systems. Then, importantly, we're going to look at ISO and sustainability and see how they relate together and hopefully learn that sustainability really is a key to ISO implementation. And then finally, we'll wrap up with some conclusions and some final tips to help with implementation. And at the very end, I just want to tell you so that you know how to handle, we're going to have a questions and answers sessions at the end. So you can type questions as you go into the chat box, which is on the right of the screen. And then we'll be addressing those questions and hopefully get through as many as we can. And if we don't get through all of them in the hour that we have, then we'll follow up with email to get you answers to what you're questioning. Okay, so moving on, before we get started, I just want to say one thing. I'm a big believer in interactive learning. People really do learn best that way when training is interactive. But since we can't really do that in a webinar format, it's pretty tough, especially with 450 of you on the line. That's a lot of people. So we're going to do the next best thing. So what's going to happen is at 2 times during the presentation, I'm going to take a little pause, and then I'm going to ask each of you individually to pause and think and reflect about what you've heard. And then there's going to be 2 assignments. And really, these assignments are nothing more than you taking a pen and a sticky note or a piece of paper and writing down your thoughts to 2 specific assignments. There's going to be a wow assignment, which is something that you learned, it was important, you want to learn more about. And the second one will be a how about, which is a question or idea that you have, you might want to pursue. And I promise you these are very easy. They're just something to hopefully, allow you to get a little more out of the session by really focusing on what you've heard and sort of applying it to your own situation. And hopefully, choosing not to multitask if that's possible, maybe turn off the email and the phone and really try to think about, how this information pertains to you, because that's the whole reason why you're here. Okay, well, then we are ready, so let's move on. What's new with ISO 14001? Well, as it turns out, there's quite a lot new. There's a lot of major new changes to the standard. On this slide, I've listed 9 items that, in my opinion, are important to understand and know about with the new standard. So number 1 is environmental sustainability as an explicit aim of an environmental management system. That's a new addition. Protecting the environment, that one seems obvious, but actually it's put in there again explicitly. So it's not just a management system for a management system's sake, but actually for protection of the environment. Number 3 talks about a strategic focus, and that means integrating the EMS into the business, not as a standalone, but integrated. Context is a new issue, and that talks about overall global issues that you need to be concerned with and interested parties. Risk-based thinking, that's a really important one. We're going to talk more about that one with risks and opportunities. And also taking a life cycle perspective. There is a greater emphasis on leadership promotion of the EMS, getting your senior leaders involved. and a process approach. So you're really looking at your outcomes and results of what your EMS is able to do. And then finally, documentation flexibility. It makes more allowances for modern computer technology. So this is not an exhaustive list by any means. And today, because of, again, we only have the hour, we're going to focus on primarily on these four. So again, environmental sustainability is a key, context, risk-based thinking, and life cycle perspective. So in my opinion, again, these are really key to success for ISO 14001 to help you and also to help your organization. So let's see how some of these could work in practice. Okay, so the first new element is context. And this is actually an entirely new clause, clause 4. And what is context? Well, it's basically about looking around and seeing what is going on in the world. It's a much broader view than the old ISO was. And its context is really important because it's going to become a part of your planning and your identification of risks and opportunities. And we're going to talk more about those in the presentation later. So this context really sets the tone for a lot of how your EMS is structured. So what does context require you to do? Well, the first thing is to determine internal and external issues. So this is this sort of horizon scanning and looking what's going on. And these are issues that are relevant to your organization. Talks about that in clause 4.1. And this is a broad, high-level view. So we're talking about, potential issues as broad as climate change, land use, but it broadens it. So we're even talking about things such as cultural issues, social, financial, and technology. You can see the list in the new standard is pretty broad. So these are a lot of things to, kind of keep an eye on. And then also part of context, it redefines interested parties. There's a new clause 4.2 that's part of context. And so interested parties is now a two-way street, very clearly. So to explain that, an interested party is a person or organization that can affect a decision or an activity. But it's also a person or organization that can be affected by a decision. And finally, it's a person or organization that perceives itself to be affected by a decision. So this is much broader than what used to be, especially that perceives itself to be affected. And so just a little note about the perceives, and they actually talk about this in the standard. The person or the organization, they have to make their position known to you as your organization. It can't, there's no mind reading here. So, for example, non-governmental organizations, community activist organizations, those are the types of groups that might perceive themselves to be affected by your activities as a company. And if they communicate with you and let you know, then they are part of your interested parties. So that's again, it's a much broader way of looking at, who is interested in your operation. Okay, so still part of context is communicating. You've looked around, you've done your issue scanning, you've looked at your issues, you've identified your interested parties, and then you have to communicate with them about these issues. And interested parties is another common term you'll hear is stakeholders. That's maybe a more familiar term to many of you. And so what's required under the clause 0.4, which is the new clause, and then there's the communications section, which is 7.4. So under communications, you need to have a process to understand the needs and expectations of these groups. And you have to include this information into your planning process. Further, you need to establish internal and external communication strategy. So it's no longer optional for to communicate externally. This is now a requirement under communication. So this is kind of new for some groups. When you look at this stakeholders little diagram that I've got here, who does your organization talk to right now? Typically, companies are pretty good about communicating with employees. Certainly the government, because that's compliance issues. Customers, usually there's a pretty good group that reaches out to customers. But how about some of these others? Suppliers is a hugely important group. Community, society, lenders, so it brings in the financial side, insurance, and investors. So there's a lot of groups to consider here, and some of this communications is maybe a little new or scary to some, maybe a little intimidating. But particularly now with the power of social media and activist groups, even activist investors, it's really essential to do this, and it's to your benefit to do this. So communications is really something that's become a powerful tool for EMS, which it had been maybe less so before. Okay, so now that was context now, and you can see there's a lot to each of these sections. Now I want to move on to talk about risk. And risk is perhaps the most significant change, and it's a real key to ISO success. It's a new term in the standard, and it emerges in many places throughout the standard. So I want to quote from ISO. This is the clause 0.3, so it's really up there. That's the introduction. And in the new section called Success Factors. So it reads that top management can effectively address its risks and opportunities by integrating environmental management into the organization's business processes, strategic direction, and decision making. So that's pretty all-encompassing. Risk is really the language of business. Risk is what drives strategic planning and decision making. And now with this new term and concept in ISO, risk-based thinking is now central to your EMS. It affects how you plan, how you set objectives, how you conduct your management review. So it's really key to be thinking about risk as you go through all the activities of your ISO. So because of that, let's look at risk in a little bit more detail because it is so important. So there's a little guy up there that's considering the risks and benefits there, but happily I see he's come prepared. He has his helmet. So safety first. So seriously, risk you will often see defined as a product of the consequence times likelihood. That's just a very standard definition that you'll see in terms of thinking about it. And high uncertainty, therefore, leads to high risk and vice versa. So if you have low uncertainty, then you can lower your risk. So those are just some of the variables that you can think about in terms of when you're assessing risk. And again, since risk is how business does decision making, it's really key that you talk to your senior management using risk-based terms, both negative risks and positive. I think in the past, especially on the environmental side, we have tended to really focus on compliance and talk about, well, we're in compliance or we're out of compliance. But you will get more attention and your decision makers will listen when you transition more to talking in this language of risk. And so here's a really key point. There are negative risks, and the standard talks about these as threats, and there are positive risks. So it's really important to remember that there are two, because we tend to think about risk as something bad, but forgetting about the reward that can sometimes come as well. So when you're talking about risks, you know, in terms of this consequence and likelihood. Managers are going to want to know, you know, what could happen and how bad could it be, or how good could it be? So that's just, you know, putting it in really simple terms. So again, negative threats are things that are adverse environmental effects. They're damages, they're losses. These are bad things. You want to prevent and mitigate them. But on the positive side, you have opportunities. And this is a really key element of the new standard that I really want people to think about. You can have beneficial environmental effects, competitive advantage, market growth. And these are top line things that a company will want to enhance and promote these things. And interestingly, sometimes issues can be both. You know, you can they can be threats, but then they can be turned on their heads, and you can find the silver lining and the opportunity. Especially, here's a good example: if you can help one of your customers, for example, help solve a problem that they might be having. So let me give you a quick little example. So Heineken, great beer maker from Germany. So what they did, they noticed that their bar owner customers were having difficulty with one of their keg products. It was a keg, and it was taking an incredible amount of energy to cool the beer. So Heineken came up with a new type of a keg that cools the beer as it leaves the keg. And so this is an opportunity. They were able to you know, solve a problem for their customers. It helped save a lot of energy from the bar owners, as well as reducing cleaning water. So that was another environmental benefit. And it helped Heineken, it helped the customers. So that's just a quick little example of you know, how sometimes you can look at risks in terms of business risk, maybe possible loss of sales, and then turn it into a competitive advantage. Okay, so now I want to move on to the third major element that we're going to talk about today, which is life cycle. So life cycle is really how things flow from one stage to the next. It's these consecutive stages of a product, and it does include services as well. You know, most of these life cycle drawings show services, but you know, there's some input of raw materials, then through design, which is a hugely important element. You can see design is right there at the beginning of the loop. And so if you can get your designers thinking about these issues and for your products and services, then that'll save a ton of work, effort, money later in the loop. So that's just a little tip right there. But you know, designers, then it goes into manufacturing, distribution out to customers. Customers use it. There's some reuse and repair going on. And then, you know, when things are maybe at the end of the useful life, they're collected. They're either sent to waste or they're back into the cycle, the loop, if they're recycled or reused as raw materials. So a couple terms, and you'll see these supply chain terms, because there's a lot of similar terms that, you know, they talk about life cycle, but also closed loops, circular economy, upstream and downstream. So upstream, that's your suppliers, that's who you buy from. And they're a really important group, sometimes not considered as much as they should be. And then downstream is obviously who you sell to, that's your consumers. And you know, typically companies are pretty focused on their consumers because that's sort of their bread and butter, who they're selling to. But don't forget to look upstream and downstream. And that pulls in your purchasing and procurement people, and we're going to mention that one later as well. So again, the circular economy is a major trend actually today, very influential trend. You might have also heard about the zero waste movement, which is really, you know, the concept that when people used to talk about throwing things away, well, on planet Earth, there really isn't in a way. Everything was either going into a landfill or being burned into the air. So, you know, without a way, then you think about zero waste, that means that essentially everything has some kind of a value. You could turn your waste into an input and put it right back into the loop. And so that's a very important business implication, because that means that materials, all materials have value. So it's not something you want to just throw away, but if you can reuse it, you get a lot of efficiencies, a lot of cost savings, perhaps, environmental benefits out of that. So there's a lot of financial and business implications to this life cycle thinking. A couple of quick examples on that one. So the apparel industry has been very on the forefront of some of these circular, zero waste kind of thinking. For example, Levi's is a great company that's done a lot of work in this area. Patagonia, they're trying to reduce the whole throwaway culture of clothing, but look for other ways to recycle and reuse them. And then another one that we're sort of so familiar with, we don't even think about it maybe, but it's become the sharing economy. Think about Uber and Lyft. These are services that you're not buying a product, you are needing a transportation service, and that's your underlying need. And so these companies, they're disruptive innovators, they call them, and this is a very big trend. There's a lot of industries that are being disrupted in this way, just by thinking about the economy as circular rather than once through. So that's a very important concept, and in terms of ISO and what life cycle requirements, it's really an extended focus now. So ISO is now requiring you to look at the service use, the product use with customers, and also end of life, and that's much broader than it used to be in the past. And life cycle approach, one of the benefits sort of on the overall picture is that it prevents environmental impacts from being shifted elsewhere. So let me give you a quick example on that one. So virgin rubber is obviously something that has a lot of environmental impacts from extraction and waste. So there was a company, Omni Tires, and they obviously use a lot of rubber for tires, as does the shoe industry. Again, back to apparel, actually. So Timberland is a shoe company, and they partnered with Omni. So they designed these tires through this partnership. Omni designed tires in a certain recipe, essentially, that they could then be used at the end of their life. They would go directly into use as shoe soles, so rubber soles for shoes, because there were certain ingredients that could or couldn't be in there for making the shoes. So again, you can see how thinking life cycle, it broadens up partnerships and ability to use outputs from one as inputs to another. So it's just a really, I think, kind of a exciting kind of way of thinking. And in terms of ISO, again, there's requirements now to use the life cycle perspective as you're going through your management system for environmental aspects, and that's the clause listed there, as well as operational controls. So you need to be thinking about life cycle as you're going through these steps with your management system as well. I wanted to point you in the standard, in Appendix A, there's a very useful guide there that talks about life cycle assessment. Sometimes the acronym is LCA, life cycle assessment. And the key point of that is it doesn't have to be a detailed life cycle, because life cycle can be its very own discipline. It's very detailed and you've got experts, but that's not really required here. It's just really the thinking. They want you to have gone through the thinking process to think through what are the life cycle aspects all the way through to end of life, and that's really adequate for the purposes of the EMS. Okay, well, now we have come to the end of this part one section, and I know it is a lot to juggle when you start thinking about some of these new things. So what I want to do now is give you a little break so that you can do the first reflection exercise. And so what that is just to take out your pen and a sticky note or a piece of paper, and I want you to reflect and think about one thing that you learned that was new, that was important to you, that you want to learn more about, something that made you say, wow. So write those down, and then also we're going to be writing those in the chat Q&A box. We're going to be collecting some of this feedback, and hopefully we'll be able to do some kind of an analysis and give you maybe some feedback about what are some common things that people are considering. So I'm going to give you a minute. I'm going to give you a little music, and you can turn your thinking caps on, and we'll come back in just a minute. So give it your best. Okay, we are back. And I hope you found that time was useful to you to do just a little bit of thinking. So now we're going to move on, and we're going to move into the second part of the session, which is to talk about what does sustainability have to do with ISO. And so, as I think you will be getting a sense of, actually quite a bit. So I want to start by doing a quick primer on what is sustainability, just so that we're all on the same page as far as what it is and what it is not. So sustainability is really focused on a triple bottom line. So that's one of the hallmarks: economic, social, environmental. And you will also hear that called sometimes as people, profit, planet, 3 Ps. And it just has the sense that you're balancing all of these issues, not just focusing on the profit as a bottom line. Sustainability, another quality of it is that it's very long-term view. It is very future focused. It talks about future generations. And this is a very different concept for especially for business that had in the past been very focused on, very short-term, quarterly returns even. And actually, this is a great definition that I will tell you. It's not mine. It came from Joel McCauer, who's one of the sustainability gurus. And he talked about that sustainability is really nothing more than an intergenerational golden rule: doing unto others as you would have done unto you, for now and into the future. So I like that, because it's just a really simple way to define what sustainability really is about. And sustainability seeks to create value. That's an important concept about value. And value is not just financial, right? It's not just about the profit, but it's also some of the non-financial measures of value. There's environmental value, there's social value, and those all matter. Sustainability is also proactive. It focuses on preventing harm, not waiting and mitigating afterwards, but very preventive. Another quality of it, characteristic, is engagement with internal stakeholders as well as external. So a lot of engagement and communication, and transparent communication and disclosures about, what your goals are and what it is that you're doing. So if you think that all looks kind of familiar, it is. That is really what we've just seen, is many qualities and elements that are into the new ISO standard. So I also do want to address, we talked about what is sustainability. I also want to talk about what it is not. These are some of the things that maybe you used to hear, particularly in the past, but less so now. Things like, well, sustainability is just all about marketing and PR. It's fluff, it's feel good, it's all greenwashing, maybe just another trend. And the concept that maybe intangibles, things like reducing your risk or building consumer trust, those things don't really matter to the bottom line to a business. So to my view, yes, there's certainly still some greenwashing that goes on. Yes, maybe there's a little bit of, marketing element to it. But, there's a lot of what's been happening now is assurance and verification activities and verification of claims around sustainability. So sustainability has kind of grown up and had to, hold itself a little more accountable than maybe it did in the past. And so I feel like many of these misconceptions are really no longer issues. There are, when you look at, for example, sustainability reports, there is a lot of verification of the numbers that goes into that, and assurance. And, what we're seeing now, so going beyond just environmental management systems, now we have sustainability management systems, because there's a lot of database, or rather data that goes into sustainability claims and goal setting and tracking of progress. And so companies are now adopting sustainability management systems to be able to really, credibly make these claims and statements. So, and especially now it's become something that investors are interested in, and therefore when there's money involved, of course, there's a lot of issues about, is this credible, is this accurate? So for all of those reasons, sustainability has really kind of grown up over the years and become much more robust than it ever had been. So speaking of reporting, I do want to talk about sustainability reporting for a minute. So sustainability reporting has really had just an explosive growth of reporting when you look at the trend lines. So as of May of this year, 82% of the Standard & Poor's 500 companies published a sustainability report. This is just one stat. And there's many others when you look at the percentages. Certain stock exchanges now are requiring disclosures to be listed on the exchange. Probably the most well-known example of this is the London Stock Exchange. So it requires certain climate-related disclosures for companies that want to list on that exchange. If you want to, sell in that market and be available, this is a big deal. Bloomberg requires certain sustainability disclosures for inclusion. And there's so many formats now, it's kind of gotten overwhelming, and you're probably familiar with many of these. The UN Sustainable Development Goals, that's something that has been increasingly important to companies. It's sort of a unified global approach to sustainability and how business can contribute to that and benefit from that. Global Reporting Initiative, GRI, is some would consider a gold standard for reporting. And they've just been evolving along their path. They started out as sort of these voluntary guidelines, and now it's turned into more of a standards-based a disclosure and report. The UN Global Compact continues to be very important. Again, companies reporting, communicating on their progress to the public. Climate Disclosure Project, CDP is the acronym, very widely used for reporting of carbon footprint. And also for water, they have a water disclosure sector as well. Dow Jones Sustainability Index, DJ SAMS, a lot of companies really compete to, to be listed highly on that. And, this is just an amazing disclosure. I mean, it's kind of like a right to know for the entire world, really, because suddenly companies are disclosing publicly about things that they never would have talked about before in a public realm. Things like, there's measures that talk about the numbers of spills they've had, the number of fatalities, how they handle labor disputes with local contract and workforce and labor conditions. I mean, these are things that really were, unheard of 10, 15 years ago to be talking about publicly. And now they're out there, in the public realm because of sustainability. So, I think people that have been doing this and companies recognize that certainly there's risks to releasing information, but what's becoming clear is that the risk of not disclosing this information is worse. And so companies are really choosing to do this. And it's just driven some really interesting developments within companies. So if you want to talk about sort of who cares, what is, sustainability by the numbers, let's look at some of those stats. In terms of employees, and I just pulled some interesting studies that were recent just to give you a sense of some of the numbers. So of employee groups, there was a UCLA study done, actually two studies, I'm sorry, this was a 2017 study. 83% of millennials say they would be more loyal to a company that helps them contribute to social environmental issues. So it helps with retaining and keeping people, the best talent to companies. Employees at companies that voluntarily have adopted some green practices are 16% more productive than average. This was the UCLA study a couple of years ago. Consumers, so let's talk about consumers because this is really driving a lot of change. So 90% of consumers expect companies to do more than make a profit, but also operate responsibly, and that includes addressing social environmental issues. That was a Cone study from 2015. 33% of consumers choose to buy from brands that they believe are doing social environmental good. And this was a Unilever study. This was from 2017. And it was a large study. This was 20,000 adults in 5 countries, and they actually looked at purchasing, actual purchasing activities and behaviors. So, some pretty big numbers. And then more sustainability by the numbers. Let's look at business from a business perspective. So these numbers are from a University of Oxford analysis. They looked at 200 studies that had been done, and it was sort of a meta-analysis of all those studies. And they found 88% showed that good ESG, environmental social governance practices, resulted in better operational performance. And in 80% of those 200 studies, stock price performance was positively correlated with good sustainability practice. So those are some, pretty solid business numbers. And then this is the real growth and trend is investors' interest in this issue. So there's been a 33% increase since 2014 in sustainable and socially responsible investing assets. And this is a really important trend. We've got, this is a U.S. number, only over $8 trillion that are invested in ESG funds. But look at the denominator, 8 trillion out of, there's 40 trillion in total assets. So 8 out of 40 are invested in these sustainable, socially responsible investing funds. So that's a pretty large percentage. And when they did a little deeper look into, what was the reason for these fund growth, client demand was the #1 reason. And then that was followed by risk at 81% and returns at 80% and social benefits. So just some really interesting statistics to hopefully show you that there are a lot of eyes on this subject. There's a lot of interest in sustainability. And so business and business executives are really paying attention to this. So what are some conclusions that we can draw from this discussion? Well, I think first, clearly sustainability has emerged as a major force in the business world today, and it's continuing to grow. I want to actually quote from you. The quote below is from the ISO standard, page 1, clause 1, so right up front there. And they talk about this international standard is intended for use by an organization seeking to manage its environmental responsibilities in a systematic manner that contributes to the environmental pillar of sustainability. So contributes to the environmental pillar of sustainability. So you can see how they've now very explicitly linked these two things together, sustainability and how your EMS is going to contribute to that pillar. So I think it's pretty clear, the importance of sustainability to ISO. And so what does that mean for all of you on the call today that are, tasked with the challenge of trying to do this? Well, I think that, linking your EMS to sustainability is going to require some additional effort, some new skills, things that we talked about in terms of stakeholders and communications and risk-based thinking. All these things are new and additional. So yeah, it's fair to say that it's going to be some effort, no doubt about that. But here's the silver lining to it. This is a strategic opportunity. It allows you to take advantage of sustainability and the visibility and the high profile of sustainability. It allows you to integrate your environmental management system, integrated more closely into the business. And you all know how powerful that is in practice. And protect the environment, which is something that we've been trying to do all along. So I would say that the ability to recognize and leverage this opportunity is really the power and the key to success with ISO. So given those conclusions, I want to just close out with some tips for you. So again, I think leveraging sustainability to advance environmental goals is going to be a really important thing for you to do. And when you talk about environmental goals now, think big. I think it's probably time to go beyond things like recycling goals and energy reduction goals. Yes, those are still important. Those are still things you need to do. But now it opened up the opportunity to really look at your products and the whole life cycle with this broad lens. And so focusing on potential opportunities in terms of positives versus more the traditional, the bad news, the compliance, what have we done wrong? What are the risks that we, now have to mitigate? So that's a real tip, and that's a new way of thinking, but I think it's going to be a powerful one for everyone with EMS systems they want to improve on. And using the language of risk when you're talking to your senior management, they'll listen. They'll understand more what you're saying, and they'll listen. The messages will be more powerful. Another tip is to not be afraid to communicate. So having this open dialogue with some groups that maybe you may not have in the past is a real opportunity to build trust. And opportunity. And building trust is a huge intangible asset to companies. If you want to look at a bad example of do not do this, look at VW. Their whole fiasco with their emissions, I mean, they lost literally billions of dollars of value was lost because they lost trust, because they lied and they didn't disclose. So that's just something to keep in mind is, don't be afraid. Sometimes I think, environmental folks can tend to be technical and be afraid that if they communicate in technical terms to outside groups like communities, consumers, that maybe they won't understand, what are the true risks or hazards. But, there's usually ways to bridge that gap, and building trust is a huge way of building value for your company. And so another tip is to try to implement all this and help ease the load and leverage your ability to get things done is to seek out partnerships. And these are maybe some new partnerships within your company that you may not have interacted with as much on the environmental side. Sustainability staff, sometimes those are different, entirely different departments than environmental groups, but it's important to link up with them. Product stewards is another group that's often in environmental health and safety departments, sometimes in marketing, and on the marketing and communication side, these are really key groups because, again, with this communications focus, they can really help tell the story in compelling ways and really, increase the visibility of your message. Purchasing and procurement groups are really important now. We talked about talking with your suppliers with the life cycle approach. Actually, I want to mention there's a brand new ISO standard, ISO 2400, that's sustainable procurement. It's the first ever. And so, it's recognizing the importance of that group. And then your risk management department, sometimes that covers over into insurance. And also I would add business continuity. These are other important groups that are looking at risks and opportunities out there in the world. Okay, so that concludes the part 2 section, and now I want to lead you into assignment number 2, which is how about. So basically you're trying to come up with an idea. How about we try this, or we could do this, or a question that I have that I'd like to pursue further. And this can be very broad. You can think broad, you can think big, whatever it is, but just thinking about what you've learned here and heard is how you could apply this to where you work. So grab your pen and your notepad and enter that one down, because again, we're going to be doing the same thing. I want you to have this afterwards so that you can think about it, and also we'll collect this feedback. So I'll give you another minute to write your thoughts down. Good luck. Okay, well, hopefully that gave you enough time to do a little bit of thinking about the talk. So now we're gonna move to the Q&A session in just a moment. But first, I want to turn it back to Andrika, our ECB host, and turn it back over to her.
Thank you, Jessica, for providing such valuable information. It was a pleasure to have you as our presenter. In addition, I want to inform all the attendees that PCB provides training and certification services for ISO 14001 Introduction, Foundation, Lead Implementer, Lead Auditor, and Transition. Now, we will go ahead and take some time for the Q&A session. The first question is, can a junior staff of an organization point out and solve potential risk without being fired by the immediate senior boss?
Well, I hope so. I hope that you all work in a company with a culture that would not fire someone for pointing out risks, because risks are the lifeblood of a company. So it sounds like there's concern that maybe these are really highly negative, and there's concern that there would be some retaliation for whistleblowing. Again, that sounds like a pretty a not optimal culture to work in, especially if you're trying to advance environmental goals. So I'm not sure how to answer that one. It depends on the individual organization, but certainly in good organizations, that would absolutely be seen as, in fact, you might even be seen as a hero for doing so, because it would help the company prevent losses and maybe look for opportunities.
Thank you for your answer. Now we will move to the second question. What's your suggestion for the best technique that we can use in internal and external issues?
Okay, so there are a number of techniques out there for engaging stakeholders. And I would refer you to, there's some really good guides that GRI has put out in terms of how to do this. And, you know, basically there's a number of ways to engage with people internally. Obviously, it's a lot easier because you've got a lot of mechanisms to talk internally within an organization. Externally is more of a challenge, so you need to use some of your you know, your public relations groups, your marketing groups, communications groups. You can do things like you can do questionnaires, of course. You can do you know, pull together little think tank groups of interested community partners, NGOs. Sometimes people will pull them together into actual discussion groups and you know, just try to get that input. It takes a little more work for sure on the external because you have to actually reach out, get to the right people, collect that feedback. But there are some companies that have done a really great job of this. If you look at sustainability reports for a company, for example, that you admire, often in the section of the sustainability report that talks about engagement, you'll find out what they did. They'll talk about how they did it, and you can get some ideas there as well.
Thank you for your answer. Now we'll read another question. What are your suggestions, tips on how to establish process for understanding needs and expectations of interested parties?
I think that's actually a very similar question to the last one. So the last question talked about, you know, where are some sources, how do you collect this information? This question, I think, has to do with setting up the process for that. You know, I think this can be something that is definitely something that you start wherever you are as an organization, and that, you know, whether that's you know, phone questionnaires or surveys, and you set that down, and then maybe in a year from now you expand that and you hold actual live meetings and you collect that feedback. So wherever it is, whatever you're doing, it's okay to start small, is what I'm saying. As long as you're doing something and you have some kind of a process that you know, you can point to as, this is how we talk to people, this is how we engage and we listen to these parties.
Thank you. Due to the time limitations, other questions will be addressed individually by Jessica through email. Jessica, thank you once again for this webinar, and I also want to thank all the attendees for joining us today. I want to inform you that this webinar is recorded and will be posted on our website and YouTube channel. Once you leave today's webinar, you will receive a survey, and we would really appreciate if you could complete it and provide us with feedback. Until the next webinar, thank you all and have a great day.